Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on our WISH webinar. We're going to be talking about how women are taking the lead in crisis management. And we're going to be talking about why female leadership is proving so effective during the current pandemic. We're going to look at some of the common traits that these leaders possess and how some of our leaders in the housing industry are showing effective crisis management and the strategies that female leaders employ in the housing industry to successfully take organisations through change. We'd like to bring in some of the conversation, some of our own examples, and it's probably going to go on for about an hour. But if it does overrun, please don't worry. If you have any questions, please still sort of submit them, because you'll be able to, if you have to run off anywhere and you can't sort of join us at the end, we'll do our best to answer the questions throughout the webinar and then at the end, and hopefully you'll be able to watch it at a later date when it's published across the WISH social media channels. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself and then I'll pass you over to Amanda to introduce herself, and then the rest of the amazing panel that we've got here today will introduce themselves before we begin. My name's Alma Sharon. I am the Marketing and Comms Lead for Greenacre Recruitment. I also run VO Solutions, which is a remote business support service. And I'm a board member of Wish East, which is an amazing network of women and men in the Eastern region. And we get together several times a year to support each other with events, opportunities and coaching and well-being, and generally just to get together and sort of, you know, build a really good network across the southeast. Just want to make a point that men are also very welcome to join. So if you haven't joined Wish East yet and you're in our region, please do consider joining. I'll pass you over to Amanda now to introduce herself.
Thank you, Alma. I mean, as Alma said, we've got a great panel today, so we'll try and rattle through the introductions. I'm also a member of the Wish East board. My name's Amanda Leonard and I'm the CEO of Perfect Storm, which is a marketing, communications and management consultancy. Prior to setting up Perfect Storm, I spent 20 years in the commercial sector. So started life as an HR director with Sainsbury's, and then moved into business development, commercial and marketing with Granada PLC and Compass Group. And I've worked worldwide in the private sector. My last role was as Vice President for Business Development and Commercial, and several crises that I've dealt with during that window I'm going to try and sort of bring in today as well. But I have worked in the housing sector since I set up my company 10 years ago. I do run a crisis management arm, and I'm also Housemarks, who are obviously the sector's data experts, commercial director, as well as leading on several mergers. So I'm going to co-host with Alma today and looking forward to a great session. So should we ask Michele to come in next and you introduce yourself, Michele?
Thanks very much. Hi everyone, I'm Michele Gant. I'm the director and founder of the Engaging People company, which basically does just that. It engages people. I focus on communications, well-being, engagement, and then I'm a coach as well. And particularly I specialise in maternity coaching, helping women through that transitional period. But my background, I was director of engagement at Freebridge Community Housing, and I've spent pretty much my whole career since I was 21 working in housing. So it's really nice to be here today to talk to you about this.
Great, thanks Michele. Ellie, should we go to you next?
Hi, my name's Ellie. I am the Executive Director of Assets at Notting Hill Genesis Housing. I'm fairly new to my executive role, so I'll be really interested to join the conversation today, sort of as a woman in a leadership role that landed it during the crisis. My background is in housing. And yeah, I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I've been championing diversity causes for most of my career, so I'm always quite keen to talk about difference and equality.
Great, thanks Ellie. And Hannah, if you want to introduce yourself.
Everybody, I'm Hannah. I'm currently the Executive Director of Operations at Saffron. You're also probably going to see my 3-year-old make an appearance today, so I am apologising for that in advance. His head is now literally popping around as we speak. So, like I said, I'm the Executive Director of Operations at Saffron Housing Trust. I've been in housing a relatively short period of time, about 8 years to be honest, but I've been in public sector since I was 18 and a half. I was in the police service and social care before that. It's been really interesting to see the strong female leaders come to the fore through this particular crisis. I think it's not surprising to most of us, but it's really interesting to see some of the traits that those people share in common, actually. So it's a really good platform to discuss it. It's a really good platform, actually, to also understand what other people are doing and what we can learn from it. So I welcome all of your questions, and hopefully we'll have a really interesting debate the rest of the hour.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Hannah. So what does good leadership look like? So there was a recent survey, and it was asked to identify a great leader, and actually up to 95% of those people identified a male leader. And why is that? Well, there are two sort of very big reasons. One of those reasons is our social conditioning and social bias, which is quite ingrained actually in our society, and it's also partly due to the mass media language that is used to describe women leaders when they make important decisions, especially through global crises. Statistically, and contrary to popular belief, female leaders actually tend to make decisive, tough actions and calls when necessary. And we also maintain emotional maturity, concise communication, and we are, as a whole, and I'm generalising here, tend to be more considerate of the whole majority rather than kind of how decisions affect ourselves and our immediate environment. And I fully expect people to challenge these statistics as we go along. But in short, whilst having to prove ourselves at top level by being tough, which I suppose are perceived as traditionally male traits, our top female leaders have also managed to retain the sort of important nurturing and solicitous qualities that are often perceived as female traits. And studies show that modern leadership actually requires this more rounded approach from both areas in order to be successful transformational leaders. Although women only make up around 7% of heads of state globally, it has become clear that our female leaders have actually taken the lead and have been most successful in dealing with the current pandemic. We're just going to look at sort of some of the reasons why that is. And I'm going to attempt to screen share with you now, if you just bear with me. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can see it, Alma.
Brilliant, thank you. So there are 4 significant things that have impacted the handling of the current pandemic. The first one is understanding the consequences. And what I mean by that is, instead of kind of knee-jerk reactions, listening to and being aware of the most important and relevant information. Secondly, the response time for social distancing measures and flattening the curve. So the number of deaths per country are recorded and correspond directly to the decisions and implementation of social distancing measures. And the top leaders responding the fastest with a measured, risk-managed response have all actually been female. Number 3, not being overconfident. I'm not going to mention any particular leader here, but whereas a lot of male leaders have tended to gravitate towards control and corrective leadership and maybe have a bit overconfidence in their own decisions, our female leaders have tended to approach more cautiously. And finally, defining expectations. So being clear what's expected of the teams coordinating their responses to the crisis, public services and the wider public, as well as what they can expect from their leaders, and to sort of translate this into an organisational perspective, the kind of leadership behaviour that help most companies through a crisis, such as inspiring others, defining expectations and rewards, are the same ones that actually help their companies now and will help them to thrive in the future. And again, these kinds of leadership behaviours are the ones that seem to be being used most by women at the moment. So I will just stop screen sharing there. And before I pass you over to Amanda quickly, I just want to give a mention to some of these leaders that we've been talking about here. So firstly, Jacinda Arden, which is probably the one that we've all heard of most lately. She's the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She implemented a 4-point plan which was adopted from an already successful fire safety plan. So she knew it was safe and she knew it worked, and she took the fast decision to adapt this and change it for the current crisis. She's been open, she's had honest communication, and she set out clear expectations. And this has actually garnered about 80% of public support, which is very high at the moment, comparing to other sort of global leaders. Angela Merkel, the Prime Minister of Germany, she was already trusted, I think, for her steady and analytical approach, but she's also displayed some calm, rational thinking and effective performance throughout this crisis. And I do apologise if I pronounce this lady's name wrong, but I'm going to give it a good try. Tsai Ing-wen, who is the President of Taiwan. She is actually the first female President of Taiwan. She spearheaded a swift and successful defence to the pandemic, and despite Taiwan's proximity to mainland China, it's actually largely contained the virus. And I think they've only had just over 400 cases to date, and I think only 7 deaths, which is outstanding. And they were so well prepared that they ended up donating over 10 million masks to the US and other European countries. Just quickly, one lady that isn't in this picture, but I think really deserves a mention, and that's London Breed, who is the Mayor of San Francisco. She's also the first woman to have ever held that office. And she took action days before her male peers, which also resulted in a lot of fewer deaths. And just sort of quickly of note, the Prime Minister of Denmark and Finland, Mette Frederiksen and Sanna Marin. She's the head of a coalition whose 4 other parties are all also led by women, and they're all working together effectively in containing the virus. So I just wanted to give them a quick mention, and I'll pass you over to Amanda now. Thanks ever so much, Amanda.
Thank you. And I think there's a couple of quite interesting points in what you've shared there, Alma, that I'd be interested after a couple of minutes to not only take the panel's views, but also ask the audience, maybe for your views around this notion of bold and decisive versus overconfidence. Because I think it's often easy to confuse kind of overconfidence and caution. You can be bold and decisive without being overly confident and blindly overconfident, and that's certainly one I've jotted down for when we come to the panelists. So just thinking about female leadership in a crisis, I think actually we should probably just talk about leadership. What is good leadership during a crisis? You know, the badge of male or female, whilst often gets used. And I think Jacinda has made a comment previously, hasn't she? Stop calling me a great female leader, just call me a great leader. Because actually it's the characteristics that some associate with female leadership that, you know, that actually are just good leadership, full stop. So just briefly then, to go back to some of my sort of global experience with crisis management, I think the first thing I would say is a crisis is a crisis. So yes, the pandemic is unprecedented, but actually we operate in housing in a sector where we're quite used to crisis, whether it's a death, whether it's an incident, whether it's a downgrade, you know, I mean, actually all of those things are crisis management. And I think the first important thing that I take from my experience is recognise the phases of the crisis, then it doesn't feel quite so alien and quite so stressful. So if you think about, I like to call crisis management the initial crisis phase, where it's really extreme and unpredictable, but then it quite quickly moves into what I like to call business as unusual, where there's some kind of normality and it's a bit more predictable, but still much quicker than we're used to, with some unpredictability. And then you start to quickly move into the new normal and starting to define recovery. And you know, there's a lot of dialogue around this at the moment. But if I picked one example of a crisis that I've been directly involved in, it would be Hurricane Katrina. when I lived in the US, and I worked for the world's largest catering company, who happened to be a big USA employer, particularly in the South. We had our head office in Charlotte, North Carolina, so we were close to the South when that happened, and we had a lot of business down there. So when we handled Hurricane Katrina, you know, we were suddenly faced with everything being wiped out. You know, people couldn't find their children. Our employees were calling in floods of tears because they'd lost their homes, they had no food, they didn't know where their relatives were. And managing that crisis, there were a handful of things that I've kind of taken into this sort of future role and the role that I'm doing now that I absolutely stand by. And I think some of those examples that Alma shared earlier on the global stage, I think can be applied at an organisational level. So I think, you know, the first thing I would say is you've got to be absolutely clear and transparent, and you've got to be authentic. So really, really clear communication, really transparent. Don't give people false hope. Again, I'm drawing on my experience from the Katrina experience, but actually ensure that you balance head and heart, because when you're dealing with a crisis, you need the people around you to work really, really hard, and people need to feel vested emotionally in what they're doing as well as in a business sense. So I think that, you know, the way we did that during Katrina was we shared the success stories. I mean, one that just still haunts me to this day, and I can feel the hairs tingling on my arm as I talk about it, was where someone had lost all 3 of their children. And we ran a voluntary help centre, and these parents had dialed in, and one of our other colleagues had the children on another line. And the only way, because all of the communication was down, that we could get them to realise their children were safe was to put the 2 phones together. And to see those, you know, to hear the emotion in those people's voices was just incredible. And I think that empathy and that sense of the whole self then becomes another crisis technique, which is around storytelling. You know, tell the stories, make people feel really vested, and also be very authentic and very human. We've seen Hannah being authentic this morning with her son on her knee, so that's great. That's who Hannah is. You know, she has kids, and as many of us do, and she's also doing a really important job. So I think for me, just drawing on those experiences, recognizing the people who are playing a role, but also, which is why I raise this point, bold and decisive versus overconfident, being quite directive. You do have to be quite directive in a crisis. People need to know where they stand. They need to be comfortable dealing with ambiguity, but look to us as leaders to provide that direction and that sense of order, because there isn't much order in a crisis. So I think what I'd like to do is just sort of pause there, so that I don't dominate too much of the time, but just sticking with this kind of bold and decisive versus sort of overconfidence, and that Alma talked about earlier. Does anyone on the panel want to come in on that point? Has anyone got a view on that balance?
Do you want me to go, Amanda? I can talk about
sure,
bold and decisive.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you all can, actually. I think that you're right, that there's many ways of being bold and decisive, and I think it doesn't mean to say that you have to be rude or come across as being dismissive of people when you're being bold, because often people can misconstrue you giving a directive instruction as actually dismissing what people feel, actually, and I don't think that's the case. I think being bold is about trusting your feelings, actually, and trusting the information that you have put in front of you and making the best decision that you feel that you can in that moment in time. I think that when I joined the police service at 18 and a half, I think this is where I probably get crisis management situation from, to be perfectly honest with you. At 18 and a half, when you're faced in a situation where one of the outcomes is you getting a punch on the nose, quite frankly, you very quickly learn that you have to be bold when you make a decision, and actually sometimes that decision may not be the right one, but if you've made it with the best intentions, with all the information in front of you, you're not going to have a punitive outcome, because actually you have done what is right in that moment in time. And I sometimes think as leaders, people can sometimes feel very frightened of making the wrong decision. And actually that can be a problem, because that can stop you being bold and decisive at the very thing you need to be in a crisis. And I always stick to that mantra of, actually, if you've made the right decision at the right moment in time with the best intentions, very few people, unless it's illegal obviously, very few people are going to take exception to that. They're going to see that you've tried your very best with what you had in front of you. And I think that's never more important than in a crisis. And if you look at the leaders who have done exceptional work, those female leaders in particular, they didn't know what the outcome would be. They had to trust the information they had in front of them, and they were bold with it, but they trusted that what they had, with all the information they had, was the best that they could do at that moment in time. And I think that's what we need to be when we talk about being bold. It's a bit of a risk, actually, at times. It's about taking a slight risk, but it's a calculated risk, which is why people like Angela Merkel have done so well, because she will always make an analytical, calculated risk, which you hope will have the best outcome, because you can't possibly know in a crisis what the outcome is going to be. You can just hope that you get the best of a bad situation at times, I think.
And I think in our sector as well, I think, you know, the regulator feels very clear at the moment. What Hannah's also talked about there is making trade-off decisions, how you have to take the evidence that's available. You know, we're constantly making them in the crisis overall, aren't we? The economy versus health, and I think that, you know, I would say that as a director at Housemarque, because, you know, our COVID impact metrics are trying to provide information to enable people to be able to use as much evidence as possible to make those challenging trade-off decisions. Can I bring in Ellie now as well, Ellie? Just because obviously you as you said at the start, you know, you've just moved into a recent appointment. I mean, what's your sort of take on this whole kind of confidence and trade-off decisions? And
Sure. I mean, I'm fortunate. I work for a brilliant female leader who I've learned a lot from. I literally did land the executive post as COVID hit. So I was in charge of 600 people, had to turn an operation around, new to the role. And I think my first point is having a female leader signals that you have an organisation with people from diverse backgrounds. So hopefully that means that you have diversity of perspective. And I definitely relied on my executive colleagues and that diversity of perspective. We had daily meetings to attack the crisis. So I think that's the first point. Having female leaders means that you've probably got a more diverse organisation, so you're able to respond in a better way, and that could be political as well, for example, in other countries. The second point, and it's a bit of a challenge to Elma's opening slideshow, so sorry, Elma. I personally don't think that stereotypes, and I know you weren't saying this per se, helpful. I think that this sort of idea of traditional feminine qualities such as empathy, compassion and willingness to collaborate are actually outdated. On our exec, our most compassionate exec member is a man. Actually, some women I've met lack some of those skills, and they're still great leaders. Where I think why I think women leaders have performed really strongly through this crisis is because the difficulties that are encountered by women through bias, stereotype, work-family balance, absences due to maternity to get to leadership positions. So by the time they get to that position, they've overcome many hurdles. Now, I'm not saying that men haven't either. It's possible, but it's not as much guaranteed as it would be for a woman. So my take on this is that women are really leading well in this crisis is because they're brilliant leaders, rather than the fact that they're female. So it's slightly different. And I think it comes back to this point around the absolute importance, and it's been brought home a little bit this week with Black Lives Matters, etc., around having diversity, having women in leadership positions, having Black people in leadership positions, having that diversity of thought. So I really just don't subscribe to that females are more caring. I just think females have traditionally been put into caring positions. So that's sort of my take on it, really.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. And I'm really glad you did challenge that. As I say, these were sort of statistics that have been brought up from sort of models like McKinsey, and you know they may be slightly skewed, and they may, you know, not incorporate how far we've actually come in recent years. And it was interesting that in this study, some of the some of the important sort of points were made, that was female leaders generally more likely to listen, apparently, and are more focused on community and teams, and actually spend more time nurturing and developing other leaders. And I just wondered if Michele, you could come in there, because you've done a lot of work with coaching and developing leaders, and whether you've actually found that it is a gender issue, or whether it is just it's these traits rather than actually sort of male or female, but it's these qualities that sort of are used successfully.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I kind of tend to agree with what Ellie was saying, because when I was thinking about the qualities, it was hard to differentiate, because I've had a really inspiring female leader, I've had a really inspiring male leader, and both of them are showing compassion, empathy. I think what I do see a lot of with the women that I work with, particularly, is the kind of thinking errors and the barriers we put up about ourselves. And there's a lot of that comes from, we talk about imposter syndrome, and I know it exists for men as well, but it really does exist quite powerfully for women. And then there's other things, practical things, that are, the maternity and the vulnerability that comes out of that. And then the beliefs that we have about ourselves. So actually what I find is we have quite a lot of, hurdles to leap over to have that belief in ourselves, never mind the practical elements as well as, the opportunities. But actually, I believe that I can do this. I know that when I had my daughter, I was very vulnerable for a while, and I felt very vulnerable. And, you have to be careful about watching out for that self-belief. And so what I think we do as women who have been able to kind of overcome those barriers, we empower other women. It's so important. And I remember my first manager, I was so anxious and nervous and shy, and I didn't say anything, but she noticed in me that I really wanted to do something. I couldn't verbalize it, but she noticed it in me, and she gave me that opportunity and set me on my path. So I think as women, we have these internal barriers as well as these external barriers. And as women, in whatever roles we're in, and it's not necessarily has to be a leadership role, because you don't have to be in a leadership role to be a leader. We have a responsibility to empower other women, because we know that those barriers exist within ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Emma, can I just come in off the back of that? Is that okay? Because I think there's a relevant point here. I actually have to say that some of the most disappointing professional experiences of my life through a crisis situation or any situation have been actually when I've been disempowered by a female boss, actually. It was an awful personal experience, and it actually ended up with me leaving the organisation because I couldn't work there anymore because I felt so disengaged from it. And I think that there's two parts to this, and that you can get huge empowerment from females, males, whoever that is, but I left that organisation and went to work for another organisation, and that time my boss happened to be a man, and he completely rebuilt me from the bottom up, because I'd had such a difficult experience with this female who actually, frankly, was threatened. It was a threatening thing. They didn't want to empower me. So I think that there is this kind of, they talk, you have this kind of literal sisterhood type thing, and I think that's a lovely thought. But I think disempowering can happen equally from a female perspective as it can from a male perspective. And for me, the confidence knock I took from it being from somebody who I actually had previously admired was much more significant than I had found when I'd taken it from other areas in my professional career. And I think it's something that's always worth considering, that actually it's really good right now that when we're seeing excellent examples of female leadership through crisis management or whatever that may be, is that we're actually really celebrating that success, because I do think there's been a bit of a history historically where it has been a slight struggle for females to get themselves heard or get themselves to the front of the queue. Other women at times feel a bit threatened by that and actually put you in your place a little bit. And that, when I was in my early 30s, was really, really difficult. I really struggled, and I had to start again, and starting again was tough and painful. And it was actually, like I said, a male leader that did that for me, because he showed all of those traits, compassion and the ability in me. And he described me as a diamond in the rough, which was the most fantastic description I'd ever had, probably still quite relevant now, to be perfectly honest with you, of myself. But it really helped me start to allow myself to polish my edges and build myself up from the ground again. So I think there's an importance right now about celebrating female success, because too often in the past we've actually downtrodden it because we're fearful of what it might mean for us as individuals if we don't celebrate people from our own gender. And I think that's equally important to do right now, and something I'm really glad to see. Actually, the media are finally actually starting to make more public than they have done historically.
And I think as well, just to take that context, Hannah, back into the sort of crisis management space, I think the thing that a crisis provides is a platform. So it's a window for the world to see the whole self. So we are all spending our lives on these kinds of calls and webinars and board meetings and executive team meetings. And as we do that, you have this window into people's authentic self. And this is an opportunity to move the needle. You know, we can actually move the needle. And then by the time some kind of new normal is defined, you know, opinion and culture may have moved on, and it would be criminal if we wasted that opportunity to move the needle. I'm just, Alma, I've just noticed we've just had a question come in, so I'll just go to the Q&A panel. Right, I'll read out the question and then we'll put it to one of the panelists. So why is the experience of female leaders that we've had in general, e.g. Mrs. Thatcher and Theresa May, not followed the examples given about female leadership? So why is the experience of female leaders that we've experienced, why have they not followed the examples given about female leadership? So why have those senior leaders not behaved, I think is the context of the question, in the way that we've been describing? Does anyone in particular want to jump in on that?
I've got some thoughts
Michele?
about it, and I think some of it is to do with the role models of leadership we've had in the past. So potentially the role models that they may have had about being a leader might have been potentially on more negative elements. And I know when I first became a manager, the first example I had of a leader was kind of working long hours, coming in on Saturdays, a sort of a quite toxic leadership example. So I started to replicate that, and I think that was my role model leadership. And so I think there's a lot about the role models we've had before of leaders who we've looked to might not have been the most inspiring, but that's what we've known, because what we do know is that, you know, you don't necessarily get management training, you know, particularly you see people who become managers and become leaders and they've had no kind of exposure to what it means to actually be a leader, not just the policies and procedures, what is it to be a leader? And so if you have those role models, it may not be the right ones for you, and you may adopt those behaviours that aren't right.
Can I come in and just say, I think, I mean, I can't talk about the political arena because I haven't worked in it, but and as an outsider looking in, it's a very male dominated sector. It's got very traditional, extremely traditional, you know, ridiculously traditional structures and mechanisms and ways of working. And if you take particularly Margaret Thatcher during that period, her approach wasn't to lead as a woman, it was to lead as a man, really. And that's very different to what you see if you look at the leadership we see in New Zealand and in Angela Merkel, who are leading as strong women rather than as a woman sort of masquerading as a man. I think Theresa May is slightly different. However, she still, to me, comes across as a woman in an extremely male environment and trying to do that sort of man thing. And I think that's a mistake. I think good leaders should, or good leaders do, just be authentic and be who they are and don't feel the need to kind of compete. That would be my view. I mean, I'm sure if we were talking to people in Westminster, they might have a different view, but...
I think, Ellie, that's quite fair. I think from my perspective, you know, Margaret Thatcher was called the Iron Lady for a reason. She acted with it like that, iron fist, and she was very male in her traits, and she dominated, which is seen often as a male trait, and that physical kind of domination. There was a fear factor about her. I think with Theresa May, unfortunately, I think actually she does have some very, I can't believe I'm saying this, but she'd have some very good positive leadership traits, but she was completely drowned out by a lot of noise that was going on in the background, and actually the one thing she couldn't be was decisive, and that caused her a lot of problems. So I think that she was trying to be more encompassing, and she actually did a really moving speech when she left the Houses of Parliament and recognised all the other female leaders at that point in time, to say it's really good to see the batons being picked up by other people. I like to see at the time Jo Swinton had just been nominated as the leader of Liberal Democrats, also short-lived obviously, but she really did try to empower women, and she did some fantastic work around domestic abuse and female empowerment. It never really got seen, it got overshadowed by actually a large group of male noise essentially behind her that was just drowning that voice out, and I think it made it very difficult for her.
Just briefly, I agree with that. I think she was set up to fail to some respects, and also if you take all of the politics out of it, it took quite strong leadership to get up every day and do that job and do those long hours with nobody in her party backing her. So her whole team wasn't backing her, whole organisation, nobody was backing her. She was on her own. So yeah, she probably failed miserably in what she did, but there's still things to admire there, I think.
And I think you're right though. Sorry, Amanda.
Sorry, go on,
Amanda.
No, you go, Hannah.
I think you're right. I think that they didn't have the role models that we would now look towards. You know, there are some fantastic role models, female role models across the world who aren't in positions of leadership. Michelle Obama is an incredible role model. She's not a leader, but she has led from the front. Oprah Winfrey, Ellen DeGeneres, all of these fabulous, really strong women that are just being who they are. And I think you start to see that celebrated and that culture celebrated. And actually, those women are really coming to the fore through crisis as well. They are still having an influence even in a time when they can't. You know, I know Ellen's a show host. She has a chat show, but she's still every day from her home delivering something. You know, Michelle Obama's out there tweeting. There's all these things that's happening where they are really just celebrating who they are by being who they are, and that message becomes so important, that rhetoric, and I think that's something that we now, and actually, you know, my 15-year-old daughter is seeing. She's seeing a real switch, a real change. You don't have to be essentially a hard ass, for want of a better expression, to be a really good female leader. You can just be you, and I think that's really important. You can just be you, and the same applies for any leadership. That isn't about being a woman. That's just about being a good leader. So to see that now play out right in front of us is really impressive, and something that we should be celebrating more and more of.
And I think, I mean, we've just had a really interesting comment, which builds on the Michelle Obama point that from one of the delegates, which is that Barack Obama introduces himself as Michelle Obama's husband, which you know the delegate loves, and you know it's a great point. But I think we have touched on two things there. We touched on role models, which came out quite strongly through several of those pieces that the panelists shared, but also touched on building followers, because one might argue, we don't want to turn this into a political debate, but one might argue that, you know, where Theresa May went wrong was she didn't build followers, did she? She didn't understand that there was an influential group that could take her down, and what she didn't do was, you know, influence that group. So I think that notion of role models and building followers is even more critical during a crisis. But yes, some great observations.
I think as well, Amanda, with Theresa May, I mean, just around Theresa May, she didn't manage well in a crisis. She faced one of the biggest constitutional crises this country's ever seen. Okay, and she didn't manage it because she became dogged in her single determined wish to deliver it without getting. That's if you look at the crisis that we were in at that point in time. Brexit needed to be delivered. The country was still poles apart with it. She couldn't unite it because she couldn't give a decisive message. And that goes back to that bold thing, Amanda, we were talking about at the very beginning. She couldn't be bold. She tried to be, it didn't work. But then she wasn't brave enough to admit she'd made a mistake. And that's where you started to see it all unravel around her, I think. And people preyed upon it. And then you had her decisive leadership was never going to last after that because she couldn't do it. She didn't have the goodwill of the people.
Yeah, good point. Sorry, Alma, I think you were going to come in when I jumped in, weren't you?
Yeah, no, I think I was just I'm trying to think what I was going to say then. I was just going to say, do you think also that all the really hard groundwork that we've done over recent years on sort of diversity and inclusion and bringing your own self to your job has helped to kind of allow that space now for these different kinds of, not just female leaders, but for any gender of leader to come in and just embody these traits that obviously have been traditionally perceived as female, but now are recognised as the modern traits of every transformational leader?
I think the whole thing about authenticity is so important. I think that's probably what's been really freeing for people. And when I think about, you know, potentially the leaders we've talked about, they may not have been being themselves, they might have been acting two versions. And I always used to say, when I first started out, I used to say there's two versions of me. There was a Michelle, and then there was work Michelle. And I felt like I had to put my game face on. And it took me a while to realise that actually I was better when I was just being myself, when I knew what my values were, when I believed in myself. And we're seeing this real authenticity coming out now in the leadership, because, you know, you have people like Jacinda Arden taking her baby to work and Hannah's son coming in. And, you know, if my daughter walked in right now, I wouldn't bat an eyelid. you know, you might do, because she might be, you know, throwing water balloons at me, but generally, you know, I wouldn't bat an eyelid, because it doesn't matter. That's who I am. This is my whole self. I'm bringing my whole self. It doesn't detract from me as my ability to do my job, my ability to support people, my ability to make decisions. But 3 years ago, when I first started my business, Thea crashed the conference call, and I was absolutely brokenhearted, because I thought they're not going to take me seriously. So what this period has done, what this crisis has done, has suddenly said, do you know what? We are all ourselves. We are all the best versions of ourselves, and that's okay. And if we can take that authenticity forward and say, you are the best version of you right now, what you believe, your values, that's what matters. We can really free leaders up, and I think we can really free female leaders up as well.
Yeah, and do you think that this is somehow creating like a paradigm shift now, so that not just now throughout this crisis, but how we treat organisational management and how we sort of go on into the future in our leadership roles? Do you think this is going to make a big difference now in how we do things in the future?
I think one of the biggest positives that will come from this crisis, and has come and is coming, is the ability to tap into that so much untapped potential. So people that have been unable to access the workplace, either for childcare reasons or caring for an elderly relative, or we've shown that working from home is a possibility, which opens up a whole realm of different ways of working, different times of day. And I think if we lose that moment in time, we're losing just so much effective resource. You know, you know, our residents, our staff, the community. There's so many people that we can access and have access to now that we wouldn't have had visibility of before.
Yeah, and just to sort of bring that point that Ellie makes into a sort of a sector context, customer satisfaction is the highest it's ever been in the sector. You know, we've got net promoter scores that are unprecedented, and that is because organisations have been forced to use digital channels to constantly be in touch with people. But what I think is going to be really challenging now is how brave are we to step back and say we're not going to do it how it was before, because if we lose that productivity upside, we won't be able to service the customers in the same way, and they'll all be dissatisfied again when we start doing repairs again, when we all those things. And you know, Housemarque's impact data that we've just published month 2 for showed satisfaction through the roof, you know, I mean, and some really interesting stats in some organizations. So I think there's a real responsibility on all leaders to ensure that we don't just go back to how it was, that we really do reimagine services in a way that actually does right by the customer, but also this new work-life balance and flexibility. Because actually, you know, forget the little buzzword of, you know, work-life balance and having to deal with childcare and having to deal with, you know, dependents. The reality is it makes commercial sense. You're not paying expenses, it's green, you're not traveling everywhere, and actually the productivity upside from people's commutes must be enormous. Imagine that impact on the UK economy and our sector. It will be enormous, absolutely enormous.
I think it's interesting, Amanda, because it picks up on a thing that we spoke about right at the beginning, which is about one of the things that people believe is a predominantly female trait is the listening element, that kind of we listen much better. I don't actually think that's the case, because if you ask my wife, she'd say I don't listen at all, so I don't think that is right. But what I would say is that what this has made us do as a sector and as a group of leaders is to listen. And we're having to listen, because in a crisis you have to listen to be able to respond in the most effective and appropriate way. So I really hope, Amanda, that we do continue to listen and we continue to make the right decisions at the right time, because I think that's the other thing it's taught us to do, actually, is we've listened and we've made the right decision at the right time with the best of the information that we probably have. And I think historically what we've done in housing, and this is my pet peeve, is we react. You can't react in a crisis, you have to be proactive. So what we've done is we've listened to what we're hearing from our customers and the wider world. We're thinking about things 3 or 4 steps ahead, and we're being proactive, and that's making a significant difference. And I think that's the thing that I really hope we all, as a group of leaders, irrelevant of gender or what level you are in an organisation, take forward, because if we do that, I think you'll continue to see really positive customer scores. If we don't, I actually think they'll plummet. They'll probably be the worst they've ever been, if I'm honest.
And what do you think, Ellie, from your sort of new role perspective, that whole kind of upside of doing things differently and listening to what customers are asking for?
I mean, one of the things that's really brought home, which we haven't discussed today around residents, is the importance of our care staff. So we have quite a big care portfolio, and those that workforce is predominantly female. They're probably our lowest paid workers, and I think it's raised a lot of awareness around women's role in society, and actually how we need to start to value those roles. And it goes back to my point around the ability to work flexibly might allow us to open the doors to people that wouldn't normally be able to come and work potentially a 9 to 5, to do things out of hours in the evenings, and residents, we've spent a lot of time with our residents, but they will benefit from that as well, being able to have access to people at different times of the day, not just traditional kind of 9 to 5 times. So I think I just don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose the awareness and caring, kind of going back to basics that we've all experienced, almost going back to our caves and kind of hunting out food. We've gone back to basics within our own organisation. I don't particularly want to lose that. That's important that we remind ourselves that we're here to serve our residents and our customers, and we can do that in a much better way. I think we can maximise our people to spend more time with our people.
Yeah. I don't know, Alma, I thought if we could just sort of recap on the options that you've got if you want to come in, if the delegates at the webinar want to come in with any questions. You've got 2 methods to do that. You can click on the Q&A button, which will be at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. And there's also, as we've seen already, a chat function, which is it's a more section with 3 dots, and if you go onto there you'll see chat, and if you put anything on the chat, not only can Alma and I see it as chairs, but other people can see it in the group as well. So I just thought I'd mention that in case anyone wants to come in at any point, rather than us just talking as the panel. Sorry, Alma, back to you.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Thanks, Amanda. That's great. I just going back to sort of what Ellie was talking about kind of the caring roles and being more visible, and things becoming more personal, rather than sort of the way that things used to be. I'm trying to find a way to kind of segue into something that we'd spoken about a little bit before, which isn't strictly to do with crisis management, but it's also a topic that we all felt was very relevant at the moment, and that the fact that there are a lot of invisible women in the home, in a lot of our who possibly are our tenants as well as men who are actually in vulnerable situations themselves. And there's been a lot of work and publicity that we're trying to get out there across the industry about domestic abuse in the home, and it's just been really great that now so many housing professionals in our industry have really stepped up and hopefully are going to gain some spotlight for what they're doing now, to sort of work with their communities. And obviously rightly so, we've had a lot of people shouting about the NHS workers and our frontline staff and key workers, but actually our housing professionals do a really thankless job a lot of the time, and I'm really, really proud of our professionals who've really stepped up. And so we were just going to share the helpline for domestic abuse, just in case it was going to be useful to anybody. And just to give a shout out to DAHA, which is the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, headed by Goody Burnett and some other really fantastic people. So if you're in the industry or you know anyone that might need to use these numbers, they're up here for you to take a note of. Yeah, and I think something going back to what Jacinda Arden said recently was that a true measure of a leader is the ability to confront the anxiety of the people of their time. And I thought that was really poignant. I'm just going to stop sharing now. And just really sort of going back to how it's so nice that we can all be vulnerable now, and we can show our true personal selves. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point. It wasn't a very good segue.
Can I
Apologies,
just
wasn't
make
very
a point?
professional.
I think it would be remiss not to talk about the Black Lives Matter, which in itself is a crisis, a crisis of kind of not listening. And I think I've spoken to quite a number of leaders who over the past week, and managers and different people who are trying to work out the best way to approach kind of resolving issues within their organisation and talking about race and having a conversation. I think it goes back to authenticity, but particularly it's been quite poignant for me being new in my role, and I've become acutely aware really quickly of the privileged position that I'm in, and actually it feels like last week it felt like quite like a heavy burden in a good way, the duty that I have to kind of make a difference and to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. And I wondered if the panel had any views on that. I think we couldn't really do today without talking about Black Lives Matters, because we have black leaders and we don't have enough black leaders, we don't have enough black people on boards.
I think that it's interesting actually, because myself and James, who's my CEO, were talking about it yesterday actually, and we were talking about what's the response, and I said it has to be what I don't want. I think sometimes we can have these knee-jerk responses that are actually quite disingenuous. So I think if you're going to have a response, whatever that is, it has to come from a place of understanding and meaning. And what I would be really disappointed to see when you see such passion and furore for an absolutely monumentally important cause. And I actually think it's a history moment in time. We're witnessing right now a really important moment in time. You have to back it up with action, and I think that what would be disappointing is we've seen some fantastic statements come out from people within the sector and wider. We've seen some really good statements of intent about what people want to achieve and how they want to change things. That's all great, but it doesn't mean anything if you don't follow it up and deliver it. And I think there's a real time actually right now to really take stock of your own organisation, of your actual self, of your personal unconscious bias that we will all have in some way or another, and really look at what we can all do as individuals, as well as organisationally, as well as a sector, to make a significant difference and make a stand and change things. And that goes right across the piece. And I think that it can be difficult sometimes. You know, I'm a rural provider in South Norfolk. Michelle will know this from having worked in a provider in West Norfolk in Kings Lynn. Now, actually, I'm quite reflective of our population. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be doing absolutely everything we can to make sure we have a representation from other parts of our population. And I think that's the bit for me, what we really need to focus on. I think that we need to absolutely come out with strong, bold statements, but make sure organisationally, nationally and individually we are following that up with action, because I think for too long we've done many things. You can take it right back to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, where we said we would do things. Did we do all of them? No. So the words become empty and meaningless. I think what you need to see, and what I would like us to see, is systemic change. And once we see those things, then we truly will have an equal playing field, and all of those things that we want to see in the utopian world that we're all aiming for will start to appear. So I think it's really difficult, but I think it's a challenge that we should be facing up to, and looking at ourselves, actually quite painfully reflecting on what we have all done or haven't done individually to make a difference. It's a tough one, and it's really tough.
And Hannah, it's interesting. I don't know whether you're psychic, but we've just got a question in on the Q&A panel. There's lots of talk in the current climate of how Black Lives Matter is different to what's gone before. So how do the panel feel this is different to the aftermath of Stephen Lawrence? So Hannah's touched on that. Does anyone else on the panel want to come on and talk about why the panel feel this is different to the aftermath of Stephen Lawrence? So I'll just move that down.
I mean, I think the Stephen Lawrence murder was horrific, and it's really sad, really, that we haven't really moved on too much as a country since then. I think the difference, I think there's a fundamental difference this time around, in that this feels like a movement, and I think this has been coming for a long time. it through the austerity that we lived through under the Cameron government, and then COVID, and there's generation inequality, and we see a lot of people that are campaigning on the Black Lives Matters campaign of kind of the under 25 disenfranchised generation. This feels to me like more of a fundamental movement, and also that it's very much kind of grassroots and on a big scale. I feel that if there isn't a change now, I just can't imagine in my lifetime that there ever will be, because it definitely feels like there's something's moving, and I hope it is. I really truly hope that it is.
I think off the back of that as well, the Stephen Lawrenson inquiry was very specifically aimed towards the police service, actually, and the systemic institutional racism within those particular, at the time, forces. They weren't called services. I think what you're seeing now is an actual cultural movement, a cultural understanding that as a country there are many things that we are not doing correctly, and we may not be intentionally or inherently or overtly being racist, but by some of our actual mechanisms and decisions we are making, it is happening. So I think Ellie's point about this, the under 25 disengaged movement, is absolutely correct. I think what you're seeing now is not one institution being held to account, it is the country as a whole being held to account, and not just the country, the world. And I actually think it's a time to really look back and be like, we are part of a moment in time that really right now we're going to see a significant shift, and that is nothing but to be grateful for.
And I think that goes to the point I was making earlier about not missing this window of opportunity that the crisis has created, because if you think about it, one of the things the crisis has created is a global landscape in a way that we haven't had before, because it's affected everywhere in the world. And the fact that we're looking at things through a global lens at the moment has potentially given oxygen to the campaign that started in the US. So I think that's probably another difference. You know, the scale and the current shop window that we've got on global issues is probably going to help too. I think there was another question. Was it, or was it? It might have been a comment.
There's a couple of questions in the chat from Judith Common. We hear a lot about the importance of emotional intelligence in a leader, but there is also a need for a degree of mental toughness to cope in a crisis. And how do the two skill sets work to complement one another? And then we've had somebody else sort of following on from that, Cam Unwin. Do you think this has something to do with the technology, social media we have now to mobilise people more?
Can I just come in on the bit about the mental toughness? Because I was thinking about this earlier, and we talk about leadership during a crisis, but I think there's an input into being able to deal with a crisis. It's about how we protect and maintain and boost our resilience. And actually part of that is a really key part of your resilience is being accepting of change and recognizing that change is permanent. And so I think a lot of being a really good leader, and I did a conference a few years ago about well-being in leadership, and particularly as that being kind of challenge at that time in the conversation for men. So actually a really important part of us being able to lead is about how we look after our resilience, our well-being, and actually making proactive and positive steps to protect our well-being, so we are in a good place to deal with crises. Because what happens is, if we're not in a good place in our well-being, if we're not feeling resilient, we're not able to make the good decisions. We're making decisions that might be panicked or not informed, or we might not have that self-belief or self-confidence. So leaders really need to focus on their well-being. It isn't a nice to have. And one of the things I think Ellie was talking about, what she hopes will come out of this time, is I really hope that the conversations we're having now about mental health, the vulnerabilities we're sharing, the efforts we're making. I mean, I do things every day to boost my resilience and well-being. It's so vital, because if we want to be able to lead, and particularly, lead through change, lead through crises, because this is a massive crisis, but other ones will come, we have to look after our well-being, and we have to look after our resilience, and that mental toughness alongside that emotional intelligence is absolutely vital to leadership.
I actually think, Michelle, you can't. Sorry, Amanda. I actually think the emotional intelligence, mental toughness, you can't have one without the other. I think and I think they're very intrinsically interlinked, actually. And I think one of the benefits you're seeing right now, actually, from really authentic leaders, is that you actually see them show their emotional side to themselves. You know, I'm in a horrible situation where I'm having to shield. I've got a young son who has a medical condition that means we have to shield. Now, there have been times when that has been really difficult, and I have no issue in my team seeing that from me because it's real. And I have openly said, like, do you know what, guys, I need a few hours. I can't go down this. I'm not really functioning. I'm not thinking straight. I need a bit of time. And I actually think that shows a mental toughness in itself, because that means you're accepting of the fact you're not in a space emotionally or physically or mentally to deliver a decisive decision. And actually people respect that. They step back, they understand, and actually that's quite empowering for people to see somebody in a position of power say, do you know what, I just can't do it right now. I cannot do it because I cannot think straight. And I think emotional intelligence and mental toughness are one and the same. And the minute I started to become what I perceived to be successful in my career is when I accepted that I needed one. I needed both. I couldn't do one without the other. I didn't need to show that I was all round tough. I needed to show all of me. And once I started doing that, genuinely my career trajectory rocketed, and that's because I accepted all of those parts of me. And I think that's really important. So in answer to that kind of question, I think they're one and the same. They're so interlinked. I wouldn't really want to separate them, to be perfectly honest.
And that actually was the point I was going to raise too, Hannah, that you know, leadership is about a basket of things. They're not mutually exclusive. It's not one or the other. You can be resilient and you can have moments where you have a wobble and you don't feel great. It doesn't mean you're not resilient. It means you're having a bad day. And that is okay. You know, accepting, back to this thing about the whole, you know, emotional intelligence just means that you're tuned in the right way, you know, to what's going on, you know, and actually you can be both. And I think, I mean, if we move on to another social media point was raised as well. So if I sort of start and then open it up, I think absolutely social media makes a big difference. I mean, social media in my mind gives us three things. It amplifies. So it really amplifies what it is we're trying to talk about. It increases reach because it's very quick and it's instantaneous. And it also helps you to sort of spread the narrative and tell the story in a way that you may not be able to through more traditional channels. So that would be my take on social media. I don't know if others want to come in on that. Alma, you're very active on social media, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of going back to how the younger generation are coming in and changing things up as well, and especially at organisational levels. Millennials are coming into the workforce and they're demanding different ways of communicating. They're demanding different ways of being led actually by their organisations. So, you know, we're becoming less hierarchical. We're becoming, you know, sort of things like yearly appraisals are going to be probably a thing of the past, because we just don't need to do them anymore, because we've got all this access to technology where we can see what each other are doing in real time. We can use different platforms on social media to engage with our clients and our audiences, and also our management and sort of the other professionals in our sphere. And so, yeah, absolutely. Social media has played a pivotal role actually alongside technology in how we kind of communicate with each other, and how leadership has actually evolved in general, I think.
I agree, Alma, and I think there's a sort of second question which links to social media around it's difficult for people who want to support the aims of Black Lives Matter but worried about how to express themselves without harming themselves through open discussion. For example, the J.K. Rowling type abuse. How can we create safe space with people that's intended? So I've experienced some abuse on social media and it doesn't feel very nice. And I do have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. I don't use it as much as I used to, because there is a danger of it becoming an echo chamber, because you follow people that then you get groupthink and all of that stuff, and you can believe your own hype, etc., etc. But I think the question about, so this week on this Black Lives Matters conversation, I've had quite a few managers come in and saying, I just find it really difficult to talk about race. I'm a white person. How do I talk to a black person about race? Black people saying they're worried about trust, and how can they speak up and say things are wrong? What if that backfires on them in some way? And I think the most important thing is that we're having the conversation. So it probably isn't very nice to experience abuse on social media, but there is equally as many people that were saying how that J.K. Rowling got it really wrong. There would be people saying, well, at least we're having the conversation. And that's where I think it is powerful. Things are being surfaced and discussed that usually you might just be talking about in your own lounge with your family, where you feel safe to have those types of conversations. It's not, there's no easy answer to social media. I don't think. It can be brilliant and it can be awful.
I think there's a really powerful quote going around at the moment that says silence is inaction. So I think that just saying something and getting that narrative going, like Ellie said, is so very important. I have to agree myself. I have a love-hate relationship with social media. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and sometimes I wish social media never existed. I also wish for myself it didn't exist, because I have been on the receiving end of some quite unpleasant abuse, quite frankly, the other side of it, because of my family situation, because I live with a woman and have four children. It's just how it is. People can be a bit it's easy to be faceless sometimes behind social media, so I think that as a whole it's really giving us the opportunity to make loud noise, make movements, make things happen, really change. But I think it has to be measured, and I think there has to be the caveat to that it's monitored and it's used appropriately, because I do also think it sometimes can be a mechanism to cause quite significant emotional harm, and I've witnessed that, and I've seen it, and I felt it. So I think that it's like anything though, isn't it? There's good and bad in all of it, and if it's used correctly, it's fantastic. But I do think that you have to be cautious with it too, because sometimes, like I said, you get keyboard warriors who can be just as damaging as if they're standing there saying it to you face to face.
Yeah. We've had a couple of questions in, haven't we, Alma? Yeah, we've got one question is, agree with Ellie. This is Susanna Wood. We had the same conversation at work this morning. What is the correct language to use? So Ellie, I don't know if you want to come back on that one before maybe Alma moves us to the next question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what Susanna means, but I'm assuming she's saying how do you have the conversation. I think we've kind of just started with, like, let's just talk about things. What does it feel like to be a black person within our organisation? What does it feel like to be a white person? What does it feel like to be a black manager managing white people, white manager managing black people? And just have that open dialogue, but make it safe. So people are going to get things wrong. So, you know, I've said I might get things wrong, but I'm going to educate myself. I'm going to take it upon myself to understand. I'm never going to be a black person and know what that feels like, in the same way that if a man tried to talk to me about women's issues, you know, he's never going to be a woman. Well, I suppose there might be JK Rowling there. I could get into trouble for that, because obviously you can go transgender, but the point is he's not going to be a woman, so he won't necessarily be able to experience that. But I would be grateful that he's asking the questions and trying to understand. And I think that's the difference with the conversation that's happening at the moment. This whole point around, let's just talk about it and work out the best way that we can get through it together. I don't know if there is a correct language. I think everybody's different. Even using BAME is not correct, because everybody, you know, black people are different from Asian people, are different from minority ethnic. Within the black community, there's, you know, people are different. And I think we're a bit in danger of kind of trying to put things into boxes. My view would be we just need to talk as we are now and have that open conversation. And I just want to make the point that I've made a commitment going forwards that I won't talk on any panels unless there's diversity of BAME diversity as well going forwards. I made the commitment a few years back in terms of women, and I just didn't want to talk today about Black Lives Matters on an all-white panel, but it was quite late in the day, so I think we couldn't kind of change it. But
yeah, absolutely.
I think that's fair. I think there's the whole, I think when you're talking about language, it's just transparency and honesty, which we keep going back to. If you put it right back to the beginning of the conversation and you're looking at what we're talking about crisis management and leadership, it's about transparency and honesty with people and saying, look, I may get it wrong, but I want to learn and I want to try and I want to improve and I want to make a difference. And I think if we do that, then that will only help us move things forward. I think that to be afraid sometimes is part of the problem. If you're afraid to be brave and afraid to try to find the way because you're fearful of doing it wrong, that is equally as much of a problem, because then nothing will be resolved because you're not tackling the issue. So that honest, transparent, let's just chat about it, like Ellie said, it becomes so important to really understand how we can make a difference moving forward. I think that's the only way, really. It's the key to any good form of leadership, isn't it? No matter what that leadership is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's also the case about when we kind of implement our diversity and inclusion strategies into our organisations, which has got to be fundamental for any successful organisation now, is how do we create that space for people to just bring their authentic selves to work and feel that they have a sense of belonging, no matter who they are, without kind of trying to say, you know, we're trying to make sure that everybody's the same. It's all about kind of making sure that everybody feels comfortable to be themselves, and you don't necessarily know how that feels, but you allow people to have the space to be who they are and not feel that they have the same opportunities as everybody else. But just wanted to quickly...
Sorry, can I just come in on the safe space, because I think that's so important in terms of, you know, because everything we're talking about, I mean, it's interesting what we're saying, because I get nervous about getting things wrong, and, you know, particularly on social media, because you know you're going to get a backlash. But I think organisations and leaders, particularly, one thing they can do is they can create that safe space, and you know, they can do that through their values for the organisation that they are, not the values that sit on the wall, but the values that, you know, run through every element of how that organisation operates. Also in terms of how they role model and how they talk and how they say, I'm not sure, but I want to find out. And I also find, particularly when you're kind of doing this, I mean, I always use contracting in coaching, but allowing them within that kind of the conversations they have to contract to say, you know, this is safe, this is, and actually be really explicit about it, because people are nervous, but people need to be having these conversations, but we've got to make it safe for them to do that.
Absolutely, and I think language plays a massive part in that, making sure that the language we use at every aspect of our organisational management and leadership is not excluding anybody unconsciously, and sort of bringing into that unconscious bias that we all need to be aware of. And we should be using the word conscious bias, really, because by saying unconscious bias, we're almost taking the responsibility away from ourselves to really kind of be aware of how we behave and the language that we use. But I just wanted to, there's a question that we haven't answered yet from Lisa Ryan. Following on from this crisis, how will the successes experienced from female leadership be embedded to enable more women leaders to come through in their employment and careers? And isn't there a risk that the male-dominated leaders will put women back into their previous roles as per post-Second World War? Would anyone like to come in and answer that?
You don't let them, actually. I think there's a sea change. There's a sea change in many things that we've spoken about. You know, Black Lives Matters, you're seeing a cultural sea change. I think you're seeing a cultural sea change and a recognition of actually strong female leadership. And I think it would be very difficult now to put people back in their places when you've seen the success of some of those female leaders. And actually, I think that just by the fact that it has been successful, it kind of reinforces that we're an equal play. It's an equal playing field, and it doesn't become about if you're male or female anything. It just becomes about the fact that you are a good leader. And I think that if we can highlight the fact that females have done equally as powerful, and actually in this situation a far superior job, quite frankly, than some of their male counterparts, then it'll be very difficult for the world and all that is watching to put them back in their place. And actually that's about making sure we continue to celebrate it, hold them up as exemplar role models, and show that we're not afraid to challenge the norm, I think.
And I think as well, Hannah, sorry, Ellie, were you going to come
I was just going to say, I think the other point is that like we all have a responsibility to challenge within our own organisation. So we can't rely on like Wish or a women's group, or lots of organisations have networks, and then it's sort of seen as the network's responsibility to deal with that issue. If you've got a board that's predominantly white male, then say something and talk about it. And if you've got if you're seeing that women aren't getting to senior positions, or there's a gender pay gap, everybody who's on this panel can go away and challenge their own organisations, and that's how we'll get the change, I think.
I think that's right, Ellie. I totally agree with that, and I think it goes beyond that. I think it's looking out for opportunities. So I know, Hannah, you were saying that there have been times when you haven't felt empowered, but looking out for opportunities to empower each other, but also to challenge, because, you know, the person sitting there might not have that confidence to do that. And, you know, I think on a very basic level, like, people call my daughter bossy, and I challenge it, because it's like, if I let that go, she will have that in her head. Actually, that's a kind of a wrong behaviour. And I say, no, she's not. She's showing leadership, and good on her, you know. So I think it's really important that, as you know, we support each other in that way, looking for opportunities to empower, looking for opportunities to challenge, because that person might not have the confidence to do that themselves.
And I was just going to come in and say that, you know, actually, to the point that was made around successful things not going back to how they were before, create the narrative of success. So, you know, I think sometimes we make the mistake of saying this needs to not go back because of A or B. You know, it needs to not go back because it makes total sense, because it delivers more, it's more cost effective, it's right on a human level. And so I would say create the narrative so that to go against what's been successful and go back to what previously had been less successful just would be a no-brainer. And I think I just want to, Alma, just as my final point, and then I'll hand back to you.
Amanda, just sorry,
yeah.
can I just add to that as well? I think that sometimes as women particularly, we're very humble with success, and actually we don't need to be, because we are as successful and as effective as people around us. And I think what you're actually also starting to see is people not being humble. Like, I've done a good job, yes I have, let's celebrate it, let's show the world. And I know that's a bit rich coming from me, Amanda, because I know what you would say about it, but I genuinely do think that actually sometimes we don't need to be humble. Actually, sometimes saying you've done a good job is okay. That's not arrogant, that's not anything other than just celebrating the fact that you and organisation and other people around you have delivered something really impressive and very important. So don't be afraid to shout it, and then you'll have people stand behind it, and that's when you start to get a movement and things change. So we don't always, women can be humble sometimes and feel like they can't say I've done a good job. Absolutely we can, and we should.
And not be apologetic.
No.
I think, Alma, before sort of handing to you to sort of wrap, and thanks, we've had some comments in just saying that they've enjoyed the debate. We've had 2 or 3 comments around that, but I think, and I'm going to miss out loads of really, really important people here, but there are some people who stick in my mind in our sector who are high profile and are leading this charge, notwithstanding the panel as well. If you think about it, you know, the G15 chair, Helen Evans, woman. Claire Miller, who I've worked with on the Clarion merger, female CEO, one of the largest organisations. Fiona McGregor, the CEO of the regulator. Kate Henderson, NHF. Our own founder, Nicola Dibb at Wish. I work with Larice Ponson, who's the CEO of Housemarque as well. Now, you think we've got some really good, strong female leaders in this sector already. So that heartens me as well. And it's one of the things that inspired me to join Wish. So that would be my final point, Alma. Alma, you're muted, your phone. Sorry, there you go.
Typical rookie error. Just to really say that what a fantastic lineup of leaders in the panel today, and I really admire every single one of you and appreciate the value that you've brought to not only your sector but to sort of everybody really that you work with and you partner up with. It's a real privilege to have seen some of your work, to have worked alongside some of you, and to listen to some of your journeys and stories. So massive thank you for your input, which is really, really valuable. And please follow these guys on social media. Ellie, Hannah, Michelle, Amanda and myself, we're all quite prolific on social media, and if you want to kind of engage more in the conversations that we've had today, please kind of join us, and if you'd like to join Wish as well, whether you're male or female, please get in touch, because we'd love to join you into our network as well. But thank you so much, everybody. Thanks
everybody.
for brilliant discussion.
Bye.
Thanks for everybody for joining us. Cheers.
Bye. Bye.